Chapter 89 of Summa Contra Gentiles, Second Book on Creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 89. Solution of the foregoing arguments. For the easier solution of the foregoing arguments, we must first of all set down certain points, in order to explain the order and process of the generation of man as well as of animals in general. In the first place, then, it must be observed that the opinion of those is false who say that the vital operations that appear in the embryo before its ultimate completion do not proceed from a soul or soul's power existing therein, but from the soul of the mother. For if this were true, the embryo will no longer be an animal, since every animal consists of soul and body. Moreover, vital operations do not proceed from an extrinsic active principle, but from an internal force, and it is in this that inanimate things differ from the living, to which it properly belongs to move themselves. Because that which is nourished assimilates nourishment. Wherefore, in the subject nourished, there must needs be an active nutritive power, since the agent produces its like. And much more evident is this in the operation of the senses, because to see and to hear are competent to a person through some faculty existing in him and not in another. Wherefore, if the embryo is observed to be nourished, and even to sense before its final development, that cannot be ascribed to the soul of the mother. And yet it cannot be said that the soul, as to its complete essence, is in the semen from the very beginning, and that the operations of the soul are not apparent on account of the lack of organs. For, since the soul is united to the body as its form, it is not united to a body other than the one of which it is properly the act. Now the soul is the act of an organic body, according to the second book of De Anima, chapter 1, paragraph 6. Consequently, the soul is not actually in the semen before the organization of the body, but only potentially or virtually. Wherefore Aristotle says, in the second book of De Anima, chapter 1, paragraph 10, that seed and fruit are potentially living as long as they put aside, that is, are without, the soul. Yet the thing of which the soul is the act is potentially living, but is not without a soul. It would also follow, if the soul were in the semen from the beginning, that the generation of an animal would be by the mere severance, as happens in annulose animals, where two are made from one. For if the semen were animated as soon as severed, it would at once have a substantial form. Now every substantial generation precedes, and does not follow, the substantial form, and if any changes follow the substantial form, they are directed not to the being, but to the well-being of the thing generated. Accordingly, the generation of the animal would be completed in the mere severance of the semen, and all subsequent changes would have nothing to do with generation. Even more absurd would this be if applied to the rational soul, both because it cannot possibly be divided according to the division of the body, so that it be possible for it to be in the semen after severance, and because it would follow that whenever pollution occurs without conception taking place, rational souls would nevertheless be multiplied. Nor can it be asserted, as some say, that although from the movement of severance the soul is not in the semen actually but virtually, on account of the lack of organs, yet this very virtue of the semen, which is a body capable of receiving organs though it has them not actually, is proportionately a potential but not an actual soul to the semen, and that, since the life of a plant requires fewer organs than the life of an animal, When first the semen is sufficiently prepared for plant life, this same virtue of the semen becomes a vegetative soul, and then, when the organs have been yet more perfected and multiplied, the same virtue advances to the state of a sensitive soul, and further still, the form of the organs being perfected, the same soul becomes rational, not indeed by the action of this seminal virtue, but by the action of an external agent, for which reason they imagine Aristotle to have said that the intellect is from without. For according to this opinion, it would follow that the same identical virtue is at one time a purely vegetative soul, and afterwards a sensitive soul, so that the substantial form itself would be perfected more and more by stages. It would also follow that the substantial form would be brought from potentiality to act, not at once but by degrees. And again, that generation, like alteration, is a continuous movement, all of which things are impossible in nature. A conclusion still more admissible would follow, namely, that the rational soul is mortal, for nothing that accrues as a form to that which is corruptible makes it naturally incorruptible, else a corruptible thing would be changed into an incorruptible one, which is impossible, since they differ in genus, as stated in the 10th book of Metaphysics. Now the substance of the sensitive soul, since in the aforesaid process it is stated to be generated accidentally by the generated body, must needs be corruptible at the corruption of the body. If therefore the same soul becomes rational by a light introduced within it, which light is related to it as a form, for the sensitive is potentially intellective, it follows of necessity that the rational soul perishes when the body perishes. And this is impossible, as we proved above, and as the Catholic faith teaches. Therefore, the self-same virtue which is severed together with the semen and is called the formative virtue is not the soul, nor does it become the soul in the process of generation. But, since it is based, as on its proper subject, on the vital spirit contained in the frothy semen, it causes the formation of the body in so far as it operates by virtue of the Father's soul, to whom generation is ascribed as the principal agent, and not by virtue of the soul of the person conceived, even after the soul is in that person. For the subject conceived does not generate itself, but is generated by the Father. This is clear to anyone who considers each power of the soul separately. For it cannot be ascribed to the soul of the embryo by reason of the generative power, not only because the generative power does not exercise its operation until the work is completed of the nutritive and augmentative powers which are its auxiliaries, since to generate belongs to that which is perfect, but also because the work of the generative power is directed not to the perfection of the individual, but to the preservation of the species. Nor again can it be ascribed to the nutritive power, the work of which is to assimilate nourishment to the subject nourished, which is not apparent here. Since in the process of formation, the nourishment is not assimilated to something already existing, but is advanced to a more perfect form and more approaching to a likeness to the Father. Likewise, neither can it be ascribed to the augmentative power, since it belongs to this power to cause a change, not of form, but of quantity. As to the sensitive and intellective part, it is clear that it has no operation appropriate to such a formation. It remains, then, that the formation of the body, especially as regards the foremost and principal parts, is not from the form of the subject generated, nor from a formative power acting by virtue of that form, but from a formative power acting by virtue of the generative soul of the Father, the work of which soul is to produce the specific like of the generator. Accordingly, this formative power remains the same in the aforesaid spirit from the beginning of the formation until the end. Yet the species of the subject formed remains not the same, because at first it has the form of semen, afterwards of blood, and so onwards until it arrives at its final complement. For although the generation of simple bodies does not proceed in order, since each of them has an immediate form of primary matter, in the generation of other bodies there must be an order in the generations, by reason of the many intermediate forms between the first elemental form and the final form, which is the term of generation. Wherefore, there are a number of generations and corruptions following one another. Nor is it unreasonable if one of the intermediates be generated and then at once interrupted, because the immediate stages have not a complete species, but are on the way to a species. Hence they are generated, not that they may remain, but that the final term of generation may be reached through them. Nor need we wonder if the transmutation of generation be not throughout continuous, and that there are many intermediate generations. For this happens also in alteration and growth, since neither alteration nor growth is continuous throughout, but only local movement is truly continuous, as we find proved in the 8th book of Physics. Accordingly, the more noble a form is, and the further removed it is from the elemental form, the more numerous must needs be the intermediate forms, through which the ultimate form is reached by degrees, and consequently the more numerous will be the intermediate generations. Wherefore, in the generation of an animal or a man in which the form is most perfect, there are many intermediate forms and generations, and consequently corruptions, since the generation of one is the corruption of another, according to the 3rd book of Physics, chapter 8, paragraph 1. Therefore, the vegetative soul, which comes first, when the embryo lives the life of a plant, is corrupted, and is succeeded by a more perfect soul which is both nutritive and sensitive, and then the embryo lives an animal life, and when this is corrupted, it is succeeded by the rational soul introduced from without, although the preceding souls were produced by the virtue in the semen. Keeping these points before the mind, it is easy to answer the objections. For in reply to the first objection, where it is stated that the sensitive soul must have the same manner of origin in man and in irrational animals, because animal is predicated of both univocally, we say that this is not necessary, because although the sensitive souls in man and dumb animals agree generically, they differ specifically, like the things of which they are the forms. For just as the animal that is a man differs specifically from other animals in the point of being rational, so the sensitive soul of man differs specifically from the sensitive soul of dumb animals in this, that it is also intellective. Wherefore the sensitive soul in the dumb animal has no more than the sensitive faculty, and consequently neither its being nor its operation is raised above the body, and so it must needs be generated together with the body, and perish when the body perishes. On the other hand, the sensitive soul in a man, through having, besides the sensitive nature, an intellective power, in consequence of which it follows that it is raised above the body both in being and in operation, is neither generated through the generation of the body, nor perishes through the body's corruption. Hence, the different manner of origin in the aforesaid souls is not on the part of the sensitive faculty whence the generic nature is taken, but on the part of the intellective faculty whence the specific difference is derived. Therefore we can conclude a difference not of genus but only of species. When it is objected in the second place that the thing conceived is an animal before a man, this does not prove that the rational soul is transmitted together with the semen, because the sensitive soul, whereby it was an animal, does not remain, but is succeeded by a soul that is both sensitive and intellective, whereby it is at the same time both animal and man, as explained above. The statement in the third objection, that the actions of different agents do not terminate in one thing made, must be understood as referring to different agents of which one is not ordered to the other. For if they be ordered the one to the other, they must have one effect. For the first active cause acts on the effect of the secondary active cause more intimately than does the secondary cause. Hence we find that an effect produced by a principal agent through an instrument is more properly ascribed to the principal agent than to the instrument. Now it happens sometimes that the action of the principal agent attains to something in the effect produced, to which the action of the instrument does not attain. Thus, the vegetative power produces the species of flesh, which the heat of fire that is its instrument cannot produce, although it acts dispositively thereto by dissolving and consuming. Since then every active force of nature is compared to God as an instrument is compared to the first and principal agent, nothing hinders the action of nature, in one and the same subject generated which is a man, from terminating in a part of man and not in the whole which is the effect of God's action. Accordingly, the human body is fashioned at the same time both by the power of God as the principal and first agent, and by the power of the semen as secondary agent. But God's action produces the human soul, which the seminal power cannot produce, but to which it disposes. Hence the reply to the fourth objection is clear, because a man begets his like in species, insofar as the seminal virtue in him operates dispositively towards the ultimate form whence man derives his species. That God should cooperate with adulterers in the action of nature involves no contradiction, for it is not the nature but the will that is evil in adulterers, and the action which proceeds from their seminal virtue is natural and not voluntary. Wherefore it is not unreasonable that God cooperate in their action by giving it its ultimate perfection. As to the sixth objection, it is clear that the conclusion does not necessarily follow. For even if we grant that man's body is fashioned before the soul is created, or vice versa, it does not follow that the selfsame man precedes himself, since a man is not his body nor his soul, but it follows that some part of him precedes the other. In this there is nothing unreasonable, because matter precedes form in point of time, matter, that is to say, considered as being in potentiality to form, but not as actually perfected by a form, for as such it is simultaneous with the form. Accordingly, the human body, considered as in potentiality to the soul, and as not yet having a soul, precedes the soul in point of time. But then it is human, not actually, but only potentially. On the other hand, when it is a human actually, as being perfected by the human soul, it neither precedes nor follows the soul, but is simultaneous with it. Nor again does it follow, if the soul is not produced by the seminal virtue, but only the body, that the operation both of God and of nature is imperfect, as the seventh argument inferred. Because both body and soul are made by the power of God, although the fashioning of the body is from him by means of the natural virtue and the semen, whereas he produces the soul immediately. Neither does it follow that the action of the seminal virtue is imperfect, since it fulfills the purpose for which it is intended. It must also be noted that the seed contains virtually whatever does not surpass a corporeal virtue. For instance, the grass with the stem, stalks, and so forth, whence we cannot conclude that the part of man which surpasses the whole corporeal virtue is contained virtually in the seed, as the eighth argument inferred. That the operations of the soul seem to develop in the process of human generation, according as the parts of the body develop, does not prove that the human soul and body have the same principle, as the ninth argument suggested. But it proves that the disposition of the body's parts is necessary for the soul's operation. The statement of the 10th objection, that the body is conformed to the soul, and that for this reason the soul fashions a body like to itself, is partly true and partly false. For if it be understood of the soul of the begetter, the statement is true, whereas it is false if it be referred to the soul of the begotten. Because the body is not formed by virtue of the soul of the begotten, as regards the body's foremost and principal parts, but by virtue of the soul of the begetter, as we proved above. For all matter is similarly configured to its form, and yet this configuration results not from the action of the subject generated, but from the action of the generator. As to the 11th objection about the life of the semen at the beginning of its severance, it is clear from what has been said that it is not living except potentially. Wherefore it has a soul then not actually, but virtually. In the process of generation, it has a vegetative and a sensitive soul by the virtue of the semen, which do not remain but pass away when the rational soul takes their place. Nor again, if the fashioning of the body precedes the human soul, does it follow that the soul is for the sake of the body, as the 12th objection inferred. For one thing is for another's sake in two ways. First, for the sake of its operation, or preservation, or any like thing consequent upon being, and the like are posterior to the thing for the sake of which they are. Thus clothes are for man, and tools for the workman. Secondly, a thing is for another's sake, that is, for the sake of its being, and thus a thing which is for the sake of another precedes the latter in the order of time, but follows it in the order of nature. It is in this way that the body is for the sake of the soul, just as all matter is for the sake of a form. It would be otherwise if from soul and body there resulted a thing that is not one in being, as those who deny that the soul is the form of the body. End of chapter 89. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 90 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 90. That an intellectual substance is united as a form to no other than the human body. Since it has been proved that a certain intellectual substance, the human soul to wit, is united to a body as its form, it remains for us to ask whether any intellectual substance can be united as form to any other body. Indeed, as regards heavenly bodies, we have shown above what was Aristotle's opinion as to their being animated with an intellective soul, and that Augustine leaves the question unsolved. Wherefore the present inquiry must be confined to elemental bodies. That an intellectual substance is not united as form to any elemental body, save that of man, is evidently clear. For were it united to some other, it would be united either to a mixed or to a simple body. But it cannot be united to a mixed body, because that body, in respect of its genus, would have to surpass other mixed bodies in evenness of temperament, since we see that mixed bodies have forms so much more the noble, the nearer they approach to an even temperament. And so if that which has a most noble form, such as an intellectual substance, be a mixed body, it must have a most even temperament. For this reason, we find that a soft flesh and a delicate touch are signs of a keen understanding. Now, the most even temperament is that of the human body. Consequently, if an intellectual substance be united to a mixed body, the latter must have the same nature as the human body. Moreover, its form would be of the same nature as the human soul if it were an intellectual substance. Therefore, there would be no specific difference between that animal and man. Again, neither can an intellectual substance be united as form to a simple body, such as air, water, fire, or earth, because each of these bodies is like in the whole and in the parts, since a part of air has the same nature and species as the whole air, for it has the same movement. And the same applies to the others. Now, like movers have like forms. Accordingly, if any part of any one of the aforesaid bodies, air for instance, be animated with an intellectual soul, for the same reason the whole air and all its parts will be animated. But this is seen clearly to be false, because there is no sign of vital operations in the parts of the air or of other simple bodies. Therefore, an intellectual substance is not united as form to any part of the air or of similar bodies. Again, if an intellectual substance be united as form to one of the simple bodies, it will have either an intellect only, or it will have other powers, for instance, those which belong to the sensitive or to the nutritive part, as in man. If it have the intellect only, there is no use in its being united to the body, for every form of a body exercises a proper operation through the body, and the intellect has no operation pertaining to the body, except insofar as it moves the body, because understanding is not an operation that can be exercised by an organ of the body, nor is willing for the same reason. Again, the movements of the elements are from natural movers, namely their generators, and they move not themselves. Wherefore it does not follow that they are animated because they have movement. If, on the other hand, the intellectual substance, which is supposed to be united to an element or to a part thereof, have other parts of the soul, these parts are parts of certain organs. It follows that we shall find diversity of organs in the body of the element. But this is inconsistent with its simplicity. Therefore, an intellectual substance cannot be united as form to an element or to a part thereof. Moreover, the nearer a body is to primary matter, the less noble it is, according as it is more in potentiality and less in complete actuality. Now the elements are nearer than mixed bodies to primary matter, since they are the proximate matter of mixed bodies. Consequently, the elemental bodies are less noble than mixed bodies as to their species. Wherefore, since the more noble bodies have more noble forms, it is impossible that the noblest form of all, which is the intellective soul, be united to the bodies of the elements. Again, if the elemental bodies, or any parts thereof, were animated by the noblest kind of soul, which is the intellective soul, it would follow that the more akin a body is to the elements, the nearer it approaches to life. Now this does not appear to be the case, but rather the contrary. For plants have less of life than animals, and yet they are more akin to earth, while minerals, which are still more akin, have no life at all. Therefore, an intellectual substance is not united as form to an element or to a part thereof. Further, exceeding contrariety is destructive of life in all corruptible movers, for excessive heat or cold, wet or dryness, are fatal to animals and plants. Now these contraries exceed especially in the elemental bodies. Therefore life cannot possibly be in them. Therefore it is impossible for an intellectual substance to be united to them as their form. Moreover, although the elements are incorruptible as a whole, each of their parts is corruptible as having contrariety. If therefore some parts of the elements have cognitive substances united to them, it seems that the power of discerning corruptives should especially be ascribed to them. Now this is the sense of touch, which discriminates between hot and cold and like contraries. And for this very reason it is in all animals, as though it were necessary for preservation from corruption. But this sense cannot possibly be in a simple body, since the organ of touch needs to have contraries not actually but potentially, and this is the case only in mixed and tempered bodies. Therefore, it is not possible that any parts of the elements be animated with an intellective soul. Again, every living body has some kind of local movement proceeding from its soul, for the heavenly bodies, if indeed they be animated, have a circular movement. Perfect animals, a progressive movement. Shellfish, a movement of expansion and contraction. Plants, a movement of increase and decrease, all of which are kinds of local movement. Whereas in the elements there is no sign of movement proceeding from a soul, but only such as is natural. Therefore, they are not living bodies. If, however, it be said that although an intellectual substance be not united as a form to an elemental body or part thereof, yet it is united thereto as its mover, the former is impossible if applied to the air. For since a part of the air has no bounds of its own, no determinate part of the air can have its own proper movement, on account of which an intellectual substance be united to it. Moreover, if an intellectual substance be naturally united to a body as a mover to its proper movable, the motive power of that substance must be confined to the movable body to which it is naturally united, since the power of every proper mover does not, in moving, go beyond its proper movable. Now it seems absurd to say that the power of an intellectual substance does not, in moving, exceed a determinate part of an element or some mixed body. Therefore, seemingly, it must not be said that an intellectual substance is naturally united to an elemental body as its mover, unless it be united thereto also as its form. Again, the movement of an elemental body can proceed from other principles besides an intellectual substance. Wherefore this movement is not a sufficient reason for intellectual substances to be naturally united to elemental bodies. Hereby is excluded the opinion of Apuleius and certain Platonists, who asserted that the demons are animals with an aerial body, a rational mind, passive in soul, and eternal in duration, and of certain heathens who held the elements to be animated, wherefore they offered them divine worship. Again, the opinion is refuted of those who said that angels and demons have bodies naturally united to them, which respectively partake of the nature of the higher or lower elements. End of chapter 90. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 91 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 91. that there are some intellectual substances which are not united to bodies. It may be shown from the foregoing that there are some intellectual substances which are in no way united to bodies. For it has been proved above that when the body perishes, the substance of the intellect remains inasmuch as it is everlasting. And if the substance of the intellect which remains be one in all, as some assert, it follows of necessity that it is, in its being, separate from the body. And thus our point is proved, namely, that some intellectual substance subsists apart from a body. If, however, many intellectual souls survive the destruction of bodies, it will be competent to some intellectual substances to subsist apart from a body, especially since it has been proved that souls do not pass from one body to another. Now this separation from bodies is accidentally competent to souls, since they are naturally forms of bodies. But that which is accidental must be preceded by that which is per se, according to the 8th book of Physics, chapter 5, paragraph 7. Therefore, there are some intellectual substances, naturally prior to souls, to which it is per se competent to subsist apart from a body. Moreover, whatever belongs to the generic nature must belong to the specific nature, whereas certain things belong to the specific nature which are not in the generic nature. Thus, rational belongs to the essence of man, but not to the essence of animal. Now that which belongs to the specific nature, and not to the generic nature, does not of necessity belong to every species of the genus, for there are many species of irrational animals. And it belongs to the intellectual substance, by reason of its genus, to be per se subsistent, since it has a per se operation, as we have shown above. Now it belongs to the nature of a per se subsistent thing not to be united to another. Therefore it does not belong to the nature of an intellectual substance to be united to another, although it does belong to the nature of some intellectual substance, namely the soul. Therefore, there are some intellectual substances that are not united to a body. Again, the higher nature in its lowest degree touches the lower nature in its highest degree. Now the intellectual nature is higher than the corporeal, and it touches it in respect of one of its parts, namely the intellective soul. Therefore it follows that, just as the body that is perfected by the intellective soul is the highest in the genus of bodies, so the intellective soul that is united to a body is the lowest in the genus of intellectual substances. Therefore, there are some intellectual substances not united to bodies which, in the order of nature, are higher than the soul. Again, if, in a genus, there be something imperfect, we find that there is something above it which, in the order of nature, is perfect in that genus. Now forms that are in matter are imperfect acts, since they have not complete being. Wherefore, there are some forms that are complete acts, subsistent in themselves, and having a complete species. But every form that subsists in itself without matter is an intellectual substance, since immunity from matter gives intellectual being, as was shown above. Therefore, there are some intellectual substances that are not united to bodies, for every body is material. Moreover, substance can be without quantity, although there cannot be quantity apart from substance, because substance precedes the other genera in time, idea, and knowledge, according to the 6th book of Metaphysics, chapter 1, paragraph 6. But no corporeal substance is without quantity. Therefore there can be some things in the genus of substance that are altogether without a body. Now all possible natures are found in the order of things, otherwise the universe would be imperfect. Moreover, in everlasting things there is no difference between actual and possible being, according to the third book of Physics, chapter 4, paragraph 9. Therefore, there are some substances subsistent apart from a body, below the first substance which is God, who is in no genus as we proved above, and above the soul which is united to a body. Further, if we find a thing composed of two, and one of these, which is the less perfect, be found to exist by itself, the one which is more perfect and less dependent on the other is also to be found by itself. Now a certain substance is found to be composed of an intellectual substance and a body, as shown above. And a body is found existing by itself, as evidenced in all inordinate bodies. Much more, therefore, are some intellectual substances found existing without being united to bodies. Again, the substance of a thing should be proportionate to its operation, because operation is the act and the good of the operator's substance. Now understanding is the proper operation of an intellectual substance. Wherefore, an intellectual substance should be such as is competent to exercise the aforesaid operation. But since understanding is an operation that is not exercised by means of a corporeal organ, it needs not the body except in so far as intelligible objects are taken from sensibles. Yet this is an imperfect way of understanding, since the perfect way of understanding is to understand things that are intelligible by their nature, whereas that only those things be understood which are not intelligible in themselves, but are rendered intelligible by the intellect, is an imperfect way of understanding. Therefore, if before every imperfect thing there must needs be something perfect in the same genus, it follows that above human souls which understand by receiving from phantasms, there are some intellectual substances which understand things that are intelligible in themselves, without receiving knowledge from sensibles, and for this reason are by their nature altogether separate from bodies. Further, Aristotle argues, in the second book of Metaphysics, as follows: a movement that is continuous, regular, and so far as it is concerned, unfailing, must needs be from a mover which is not moved, neither per se nor accidentally, as we have proved above. Also, several movements must proceed from several movers. Now the movement of the heaven is continuous, regular, and so far as it is concerned, unfailing. And besides the first movement, there are many such movements in the heaven, as is proved by the observations of astronomers. Hence there must be several movers who are not moved, neither per se nor accidentally. But no body moves unless itself be moved, as we proved above. Moreover, an incorporeal mover that is united to a body is moved accidentally according as the body is moved, as instanced by the soul. Therefore, there must be several movers that are neither bodies nor united to bodies. Now the heavenly movements proceed from an intellect, as was shown above. Therefore, there are several intellectual substances that are not united to bodies. This agrees with the opinion of Dionysius, who says, in On the Divine Names 4, in speaking of the angels, that they are understood to be immaterial and incorporeal. Hereby is refuted the error of the Sadducees, who said that there is no spirit, as also the assertion of the philosophers of old, who said that every substance is corporeal. And the opinion of Origen, who said that with the exception of the Divine Trinity, no substance can subsist apart from a body. And of all those others who hold that all angels, both good and bad, have bodies naturally united to them. End of chapter 91. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 92 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 92. Of the great number of separate substances. It must here be noted that Aristotle attempts to prove that not only some intellectual substances exist apart from a body, but also that they are of the same nature, neither more nor less, as the movements observed in the heaven. Thus he proves that in the heaven there are no movements that cannot be observed by us, from the fact that every movement in the heaven is on account of the movement of some star, which is perceptible to the senses, since the spheres carry the stars and the movement of the carrier is on account of the movement of the carried. Again, he proves that there are no separate substances from which some movement does not result in the heaven, because, since the heavenly movements are directed to the separate substances as their respective ends, if there were any separate substances besides those which he enumerates, there would be certain movements directed to them as an end. Otherwise, such movements would be imperfect. Wherefore he concludes from these premises that separate substances are not more numerous than the movements that are and can be observed in the heaven, and all the more since there are not several heavenly bodies within the same species, so that there might also be several movements unknown to us. But this argument is not cogent, for in things directed to an end, necessity depends on the end, as he himself teaches in the second book of Physics, and not vice versa. Wherefore, if, as he states, the heavenly movements are directed to separate substances as their respective ends, we cannot necessarily conclude the number of the aforesaid substances from the number of the movements. For it might be said that there are some separate substances of a higher nature than those which are the proximate ends of the heavenly movements, even as, if tools be on account of the men who work by means of them, this does not hinder there being other men who do not work immediately with those tools, but direct the workers. Hence, Aristotle himself adduces this argument, not as cogent, but as probable, for he says, in the second book of Metaphysics, in the same place, "Wherefore it is reasonable to reckon such to be the number of unchangeable substances and principles, for we may leave it to more capable persons to decide the point with certainty." It remains then to be shown that the intellectual substances that are separated from bodies are far more numerous than the heavenly movements. For intellectual substances transcend, in their genus, all corporeal nature. Wherefore we must mark the degrees of the aforesaid substances according to their transcendency above corporeal nature. Now some intellectual substances are raised above corporeal substance in their generic nature alone, and are nevertheless united to bodies as forms, as shown above. And since the being of intellectual substances, as regards its genus, is nowise dependent on a body, as we have proved, we find a higher grade of the aforesaid substances, which, though not united to bodies as forms, are nevertheless the proper movers of certain definite bodies. In like manner, the nature of an intellectual substance does not depend on its causing movement, since to move is consequent upon their principal operation, which is to understand. Hence, there will be yet a higher grade of intellectual substances, which are not the proper movers of certain bodies, but are raised above movers. Moreover, even as that which acts by its nature acts by its natural form, so that which acts by its intelligence acts by its intellectual form, as instanced in those who act by their art. Accordingly, as the natural agent is proportionate to the patient by reason of its natural form, so the intellectual agent is proportionate to the patient and to the thing made through the form of its intellect, so that, in effect, the intellective form is such that it can be induced by the agent's action into the matter which receives it. Hence the proper movers of the spheres, since they move by their intellect, if we wish to uphold the opinion of Aristotle on this point, must needs have such intelligences as are in harmony with the movements of the spheres, and reproducible in natural things. But above these intelligible concepts, we can apprehend some that are yet more universal, because the intellect apprehends the forms of things in a manner that is more universal than is their being in things. For which reason, we find that the form of the speculative intellect is more universal than that of the practical intellect, and among the practical arts, the concept of the commanding art is more universal than that of the executive art. Now we must assign degrees to intellectual substances according to the degree of intellectual operation proper to them. Therefore, there are some intellectual substances above those which are the proper and proximate movers of certain definite spheres. Again, seemingly, the order of the universe requires that whatever is more noble among things should exceed in quantity or number the less noble, since the less noble would seem to be for the sake of the more noble. Hence the more noble things, as existing for their own sake, should be as numerous as possible. Hence we find that incorruptible, that is, the heavenly bodies so far surpass corruptible, that is, the elemental bodies, that the latter are inconsiderable in quantity as compared with the former. Now just as the heavenly bodies, being incorruptible, are more noble than the elements which are corruptible, so intellectual substances are more noble than all bodies, even as the immovable and the immaterial is more noble than the movable and material. Therefore, separate intellectual substances surpass in number the whole multitude of material things, and consequently, they are not confined to the number of heavenly movements. Again, the species of material things are multiplied not through their matter but through their form. Now forms existing apart from matter have a more complete and universal being than forms existing in matter, because forms are received into matter according to the receptivity of matter. Wherefore seemingly, forms existing apart from matter, which we call separate substances, are not less in number than the species of material things. Yet we do not therefore say that separate substances are the species of these sensible things, as the Platonists maintained. For since they could not attain to the knowledge of the aforesaid substances except from sensibles, they supposed those substances to be of the same species as these, or rather to be the species of these latter, even as a person who had not seen the sun, moon, and stars, and heard that they were incorruptible bodies, might call them by the names of these corruptible bodies, thinking them to be of the same species as these, which would not be possible. In like manner, it is impossible that immaterial substances be of the same species as material, or that they be the species of the latter substances, because the specific nature of these sensible things requires matter, though not this matter, which is the proper principle of the individual, even as the specific nature of man requires flesh and bones, but not this flesh and these bones, which are the principles of Socrates and Plato. Accordingly, we do not say that separate substances are the species of these sensibles, but that they are other species more noble than these, forasmuch as the pure is raised above the mixture. And thus those substances must needs be more numerous than the species of these material things. Further, the possibility of multiplication applies to a thing in its intelligible being rather than in its material being. For we grasp, with our intellect, many things which cannot have being in matter, the result being that any straight line can be produced mathematically, but not in nature, while it is possible for the rarefaction of bodies, the velocity of movements, the diversity of shapes to be multiplied indefinitely in thought, although it is impossible in fact. Now, separate substances have intelligible being by their nature, and consequently, a greater multiplicity is possible in them than in material substances, taking into account their respective properties and natures. Now, in things everlasting, there is no distinction between actual and possible being, according to the third book of Physics, chapter 4, paragraph 9. Therefore, the multitude of separate substances surpasses that of material bodies. Holy Writ bears witness to this, for it is said in Daniel chapter 7, verse 10, "Thousands of thousands ministered to him, and 10,000 times 100,000 stood before him." And Dionysius, in the Celestial Hierarchy 14, says that the number of those substances surpasses all material multitude. Hereby we set aside the error of those who said that the number of the separate substances corresponds to the number of heavenly movements, or of the heavenly spheres, as well as the error of Rabbi Moses, who said that the number ascribed by Scripture to the angels is not the number of separate substances, but of forces in this lower world, as if one were to give to the concupiscible power the name of spirit of concupiscence, and so on. End of chapter 92. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 93 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 93. That there are not several separate substances of one species. From what has been said concerning these substances, it may be shown that there are not separate substances of one species. For it has been proved above that separate substances are subsistent quiddities. Now the species of a thing is signified by its definition, for this is the sign of a thing's quiddity, according to 1 Topics, chapter 3, paragraph 2. Hence, a subsistent quiddity is a subsistent species. Therefore, there cannot be several separate substances unless they be several species. Further, whatever things are the same in species but differ numerically have matter, since a difference resulting from form involves a specific difference, whereas that which results from matter causes a diversity of number. Now separate substances are utterly devoid of matter, whether as part of themselves or by being united to matter as its form. Therefore, they cannot possibly be several of one species. Moreover, the purpose for which, in corruptible things, there are several individuals in one species is that the specific nature which cannot be preserved forever in one individual may be preserved in many. Wherefore, even in incorruptible bodies, there is but one individual in one species. Now the nature of a separate substance can be preserved in one individual, since they are incorruptible, as we proved above. Therefore there is no need for several individuals of the same species in those substances. Again, in each individual, that which belongs to the species is more noble than that which is the principle of individuality existing apart from the specific nature. Consequently, the multiplicity of species adds more nobility to the universe than the multiplicity of individuals of one species. Now the perfection of the universe applies especially to separate substances. Therefore, it is more in keeping with the perfection of the universe that they should be many differing in species than that they should be multiplied numerically within the same species. Further, separate substances are more perfect than the heavenly bodies. Now, in the heavenly bodies, by reason of their perfection, one species contains but one individual, both because each one of them consists of the whole matter pertaining to its species, and because the one individual possesses perfectly the power of its species for the fulfillment of the purpose to which that species is directed in the universe, as especially may be seen in the sun and moon. Much more therefore should we find but one individual of the one species in the separate substances. End of chapter 93. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 94 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 94. That the separate substance and the soul are not of one species. Furthermore, it can be proved from the foregoing that the soul is not of the same species with separate substances. For there is a greater difference between the human soul and a separate substance than between one separate substance and another. Now, separate substances are all specifically distinct from one another, as we have proved. Much more, therefore, is a separate substance specifically distinct from the soul. Moreover, each thing has its proper being according to its specific nature, because things which have a different kind of being have a different species. Now, the being of the human soul and that of a separate substance are not of the same kind, since the body cannot communicate in the being of a separate substance, whereas it can communicate in the being of the human soul, which is united in being to the body as form to matter. Therefore, the human soul differs in species from separate substances. Again, that which is specified by itself cannot be of the same species as that which is not specified by itself, but is in part of a species. Now, the separate substance is specified by itself, whereas the soul is not, but is part of the human species. Hence, it is impossible that the soul be of the same species as separate substances, except on the supposition that man be of the same species as they, which is clearly impossible. Further, the species of a thing is gathered from its operation, since operation indicates the power which reveals the essence. Now, the proper operation of a separate substance, and of the intellect of soul, is understanding. But the separate substance's mode of understanding is wholly different from that of the soul, because the soul understands by receiving from the phantasms, but not so the separate substance, since it has no corporeal organs wherein phantasms must needs be. Therefore, the human soul and the separate substance are not of the same species. End of chapter 94. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 95 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 95. How we are to understand genus and species in separate substances. It is necessary to consider wherein species differ in separate substances. For in material things of the same genus and differing in species, the ratio of the genus is derived from the material principle, and the specific difference from the formal principle. Thus the sensitive nature, whence is derived the ratio of animal, is, in man, material in respect of the intellect of nature, whence is derived the specific difference of man, namely rational. Consequently, if separate substances are not composed of matter and form, as is evident from what has been said, it is not clear how we are to ascribe to them genus and specific difference. Accordingly, it must be observed that the various species of things possess the nature of being in degrees. For in the first division of being we find at the very outset something perfect, namely substantial, per se, being and actual being, and something imperfect, namely accidental being and potential being. In like manner, if we run through the various species, we find that one species has an additional grade of perfection over another. For instance, animals over plants, and animals endowed with locomotion over those that are immovable. Again, in colors, one species is seen to be more perfect than another, according as it approaches to whiteness. Hence Aristotle, in the 8th book of Metaphysics, says that the definitions of things are like a number, the species of which is changed by the subtraction or addition of unity. In the same way as a different species results in definitions, if a difference be removed or added. Wherefore the ratio of a determinate species consists in this, that the common nature is placed in a determinate degree of being. And since in things composed of matter and form, the form is the term, as it were, and that which is determined thereby is the matter or something material, it follows that the ratio of the genus must be taken from the material, and the specific difference from the formal element. Hence there results one thing from difference and genus, even as from matter and form. And just as it is one and the same nature that results from matter and form, so the difference does not add an extraneous nature to the genus, but is a determination of the generic nature itself. For instance, if we take as a genus an animal with feet, a difference thereof will be an animal with 2 feet, which difference clearly adds nothing extraneous to the genus. It is therefore evident that it is accidental to the genus and difference, that the determination denoted by the difference be caused by a principle other than the generic nature, since the nature signified by the definition is composed of matter as determined and form as determining. Hence, if there be a simple nature, it will be determined by itself, nor will it need to have 2 parts, one determining and the other determined. Consequently, the ratio of genus will be derived from the ratio of its nature, and its specific difference will be derived from its determination in that it is placed in a determinate grade of being. It also follows from this that if any nature be without limits and infinite in itself, as we have shown to be the case with the divine nature, we cannot ascribe to it either genus or species, and this agrees with what we have proved about God. Moreover, since the difference of species is attributed to separate substances according as various degrees are ascribed to them, and since there are not several individuals in one species, it is clear from what has been said that no 2 separate substances are equal in degree, but that one is naturally above another. Hence it is stated in Job chapter 38, verse 33, "Dost thou know the order of heaven?" And Dionysius says, in the Celestial Hierarchy 10, that even as in the whole multitude of angels there is a supreme, middle, and lowest hierarchy, so in each hierarchy there is a highest, a middle, and a lowest order, and in each order, highest, middle, and lowest angels. Hereby is excluded the opinion of Origen, who said that all spiritual substances were created equal from the beginning, among which he reckoned even souls, and that the difference which we find among these substances, in that this one is united to a body, and that one not, that this one is higher, and that one lower, results from a difference of merits. For we have shown that this difference of degree is natural, that the soul is not of the same species as separate substances, nor the separate substances themselves of the same species with one another, and that they are not equal in the order of nature. End of chapter 95. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 96 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 96. That separate substances do not gather their knowledge from sensibles. From what has been laid down, it may be shown that separate substances do not receive intellective knowledge from sensible things. For sensibles by their very nature are adapted to be apprehended by the sense as intelligibles by the intellect. Wherefore every substance that is capable of knowledge, and derives that knowledge from sensibles, is endowed with sensitive cognition, and consequently has a body united to it naturally, since sensitive knowledge is impossible without a bodily organ. But separate substances have not a body naturally united to them, as we proved above. Therefore they do not derive intellective knowledge from sensible things. Moreover, a higher power must needs have a higher object. Now the intellective power of a separate substance is higher than that of the human soul, since the human soul's intelligence is the lowest in the order of intellects, as we proved above, and the object of the human soul's intelligence is a phantasm, as stated above. And this is higher in the order of objects than a sensible thing existing outside the mind, as appears from the order of cognitive powers. Consequently, the object of a separate substance cannot be a thing existing outside the mind as the direct object whence it derives its knowledge, nor can it be a phantasm. It follows, in consequence, that the object of the separate substance's intellect is something higher than a phantasm. Now, nothing is higher than a phantasm in the order of knowable objects, save that which is intelligible actually. Wherefore separate substances do not derive intellectual knowledge from sensibles, but they understand things which are intelligible even in themselves. Again, the order of intelligibles is in accordance with the order of intellects. Now things intelligible in themselves are, in the order of intelligibles, above those things which are not intelligible, but for the fact that we make them intelligible. And such must needs be all intelligibles taken from sensibles, because sensibles are not in themselves intelligible. But such are the intelligibles which our intellect understands. Therefore the intellect of the separate substance, since it is above our intellect, does not understand intelligibles received from sensibles, but it understands those which are intelligible actually. Moreover, the mode of a thing's proper operation is in keeping with the mode of that thing's substance and nature. Now a separate substance is an intellect existing by itself and not in a body. Consequently, its intellectual operation will be directed to intelligibles that are not founded on a body. But all intelligibles taken from sensibles are somewhat founded on bodies. For instance, our intelligibles are founded on the phantasms which are in bodily organs. Therefore, separate substances do not derive knowledge from sensibles. Further, just as primary matter is the lowest in the order of things sensible, and is consequently only in potentiality to all sensible forms, so the possible intellect, being the lowest in the order of things intelligible, is in potentiality to all intelligibles, as is clear from what has been said. Now those things which, in the order of sensibles, are above primary matter, have their form actually, whereby they are established in sensible being. Therefore separate substances which, in the order of intelligibles, are above the human possible intellect, are actually in intelligible being. For the intellect that receives knowledge from sensibles is in intelligible being not actually, but potentially. Therefore a separate substance does not receive knowledge from sensibles. Again, the perfection of a higher nature does not depend on a lower nature. Now the perfection of separate substances, since they are intellectual, consists in understanding. Therefore their understanding does not depend on sensible things in such a way as to derive knowledge from them. Hence it is evident that in separate substances there is not an active and a possible intellect, except perhaps in an equivocal sense, because a possible and an active intellect are found in the intellect of soul, forasmuch as it derives its knowledge from sensibles. Since it is the active intellect that makes the species received from sensibles to be actually intelligible, and the possible intellect is that which is in potentiality to the knowledge of all forms of sensible things. Wherefore, since separate substances do not derive their knowledge from sensibles, there is not in them an active and a possible intellect. Hence Aristotle, in the third book of De Anima, in establishing the possible and active intellects, states that we need to place them in the soul. It is also evident that in these same substances, local distance cannot hinder the knowledge of separate substances. For local distance is per se referable to sense, and not to the intellect except accidentally, insofar as it receives from sense, because sensibles move the senses at a determinate distance. Now things intelligible actually, insofar as they move the intellect, are not in place, for they are separate from corporeal matter. Since then separate substances do not derive intellective knowledge from sensibles, local distance has no effect on their knowledge. Again, it is clear that time has nothing to do with their intellectual operation. For just as things actually intelligible are apart from place, so are they apart from time, because time is consequent upon local movement. Wherefore it measures only such things as are somehow in place. Consequently, the understanding of a separate substance transcends time, whereas time is incidental to our intellectual operation, since we derive our knowledge from phantasms which relate to a determinate time. Hence it is that in composition and division, our intellect always includes time past or future, but not in understanding what a thing is. For it understands what a thing is by abstracting intelligibles from sensible conditions. Wherefore, in respect of that operation, it understands the intelligible apart from time and all conditions of things sensible, whereas it composes and divides by applying previously abstracted intelligibles to things, and in this application, time must of necessity be implied. End of chapter 96. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 97 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 97. That the intellect of a separate substance always understands actually. From the foregoing, it is also clear that the intellect of a separate substance always understands actually. For that which is sometimes in act and sometimes in potentiality is measured by time. But the intellect of a separate substance transcends time, as we have proved. Therefore, it is not sometimes actually understanding and sometimes not. Moreover, every living substance exercises actually some operation by virtue of its nature, although other operations are in it potentially. Thus animals are always in the process of nourishment, although they do not always sense. Now separate substances are living substances, as is clear from what has been said. Therefore, by their nature, they must needs be always actually understanding. Again, the separate substances, according to the teaching of philosophers, move the heavenly bodies by their intellect. Now the movement of the heavenly bodies is always continuous. Therefore, the understanding of separate substances is continuous and perpetual. The same conclusion follows even if we deny that they move the heavenly bodies, since they are higher than the heavenly bodies. Wherefore, if the proper operation of a heavenly body, which is its movement, is continuous, much more will the proper operation of separate substances, namely understanding, be continuous. Moreover, whatever sometimes operates and sometimes does not operate is moved either per se or accidentally. Wherefore the fact that we are sometimes understanding and sometimes not understanding is due to an alteration in the sensible faculty, as stated in the 7th book of Physics. But separate substances are not moved per se, since they are not bodies, nor are they moved accidentally, since they are not united to bodies. Therefore their proper operation, which is to understand, is continual in them without any interruption. End of chapter 97. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 98 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 98. How one separate substance understands another. If separate substances understand things that are by themselves intelligible, as we have proved, and if separate substances are by themselves intelligible, since freedom from matter makes a thing intelligible by itself, as appears from the foregoing, it follows that separate substances understand separate substances as their proper objects. Wherefore each of them knows itself and others. Each one indeed knows itself otherwise than the possible intellect knows itself. For the possible intellect is in potentiality in intelligible being, and is made actual by the intelligible species, even as primary matter is made actual in sensible being by a natural form. Now nothing is known according as it is only in potentiality, but a thing is known according as it is in act. Hence the form is the principle whereby we know the thing which is made actual thereby, and in like manner the cognitive power is made actually cognizant by some species. Accordingly, our intellect does not know itself except by the species whereby it is made actual in intelligible being. For which reason Aristotle, in the 3rd book of De Anima, says that it is knowable in the same way as other things, namely, by species derived from phantasms as by their proper forms. On the other hand, separate substances, by their nature, exist actually in intelligible being. Wherefore each one of them knows itself by its essence, and not by the species of another thing. Since, however, all knowledge is according as the image of the thing known is in the knower, and since one separate substance is like another as regards the common generic nature, while they differ the one from the other in regard to the species, as appears from the foregoing, it would seem to follow that the one does not know the other as regards its proper specific nature, but only as regards the common nature of their genus. Accordingly, some say that one separate substance is the efficient cause of another. Now in every efficient cause, there must be the image of its effect, and likewise in every effect, there must be the likeness of its cause, because every agent produces its like. Hence, in the higher separate substance, there exists the likeness of the lower, as in the cause there is the likeness of its effect. While in the lower there is the likeness of the higher, as in the effect there is the likeness of its cause. Now if we consider non-univocal causes, the likeness of the effect exists in the cause in a more eminent manner, and the likeness of the cause is in its effect in a less eminent manner. And the higher separate substances must needs be causes of this kind with respect to the lower separate substances, because they are placed in various degrees which are not of one species. Therefore, a lower separate substance knows a higher, according to the mode of the substance knowing, and not according to the mode of the substance known, but in a lower manner, whereas the higher knows the lower in a more eminent way. This is the meaning of the statement in De Causis that an intelligence knows what is below it and what is above it according to the mode of its substance, because the one is the cause of the other. But since we have shown above that intellectual separate substances are not composed of matter and form, they cannot be caused except by way of creation. Now to create belongs to God alone, as we proved above. Therefore, one separate substance cannot be the cause of another. Further, it has been proved that the principal parts of the universe are all created immediately by God. Therefore, one of them is not caused by another. Now, each of the separate substances is a principal part of the universe, much more than the sun or moon, since each of them has its proper species, which is also more noble than any species of things corporeal. Therefore, one of them is not caused by another, but all are produced immediately by God. Hence, according to the foregoing, each of the separate substances knows God by its natural knowledge, according to the mode of its substance, whereby they are like God as their cause. But God knows them as their proper cause, having in himself the likeness of them all. Yet one separate substance is unable to know another in this way, since one is not the cause of another. We must therefore observe that, since none of these substances according to its essence is an adequate principle of the knowledge of all other things, it is necessary for each of them, in addition to its own substance, to have some intelligible images, whereby each of them is enabled to know another in its proper nature. This can be made clear in the following manner. The proper object of an intellect is an intelligible being, and this includes all possible differences and species of being, because whatever can be is intelligible. Now, since all knowledge is caused by some kind of likeness, the intellect is unable to know its object wholly, unless it has in itself the likeness of all being and of all its differences. But such a likeness of all being can only be an infinite nature, which is not confined to any species or genus of being, but is the universal principle and active force of all being. And this is the divine nature alone, as we proved in the first book. And every other nature, since it is confined to some genus or species of being, cannot be a universal likeness of all being. It follows, therefore, that God alone, by his essence, knows all things, while every separate substance, by its nature, knows its own species alone with a perfect knowledge. Whereas the possible intellect does not know itself at all thus, but by its intelligible species, as stated above. Now, from the very fact that a particular substance is intellectual, it is capable of understanding all being. Wherefore, as a separate substance is not, by its nature, made actually to understand all being, that substance, considered in itself, is in potentiality, as it were, to the intelligible images whereby all being is known, and these images will be its acts, according as it is intellectual. But it is not possible that these images be otherwise than several. For it has already been proved that the perfect image of the whole universal being cannot but be infinite, and just as the nature of a separate substance is not infinite, but limited, so an intelligible image existing therein cannot be infinite, but is confined to some species or genus of being. Wherefore, several such images are requisite for the comprehension of all being. Now, the higher a separate substance is, the more is its nature similar to the divine, and consequently it is less limited, as approaching nearer to the perfection and goodness of the universal being, and for this reason it has a more universal participation of goodness and being. Consequently, the intelligible images that are in the higher substance are less numerous and more universal. This agrees with the statement of Dionysius in the Celestial Hierarchy 12 that the higher angels have a more universal knowledge. And it is said in De Causis that the higher intelligences have more universal forms. Now the highest point of this universality is in God, who knows all things by one, namely his essence, whereas the lowest is in the human intellect, which, for each intelligible object, requires an appropriate intelligible species commensurate with that object. It follows that, with the higher substances, knowledge through the more universal forms is not more perfect as it is with us. For through the image of animal, whereby we know something in its genus only, we have a more imperfect knowledge than through the image of man, whereby we know the complete species. Since to know a thing as to its genus only is to know it imperfectly and potentially, as it were, whereas to know a thing as to its species is to know it perfectly and actually. Now our intellect, since it obtains the lowest place in intellectual substances, requires images particularized to that extent that to each proper object of its knowledge there must needs correspond a proper image in it. Wherefore, by the image of animal, it knows not rational, and consequently neither does it know man, except in a certain respect. On the other hand, the intelligible image that is in a separate substance is of more universal virtue, and suffices to represent more things. Consequently, it argues not a more imperfect, but a more perfect knowledge, because it is virtually universal, like the active form in a universal cause, which, the more universal it is, the greater the extent of its efficiency, and the more efficacious its production. Therefore, by one image it knows both animal and the differences of animal. Or again, it knows them in a more universal or more limited way according to the order of the aforesaid substances. Hence we may take examples of this, as we have stated, in the two extremes, namely, in the divine and human intellects. For God knows all things by one, namely his essence, while man requires different likenesses to know different things. Moreover, the higher his intellect, the more things he is able to know through fewer. Wherefore, we need to give particular examples to those who are slow of intelligence, in order that they may acquire knowledge about things. Now, since a separate substance, considered in its nature, is in potentiality to the images by which all being is known, we must not think that it is devoid of all such images, for such is the disposition of the possible intellect before it understands, as stated in the third book of De Anima. Nor again must we think that it has some of them actually, and others potentially only, even as primary matter in the lower bodies has one form actually, and others potentially. And as our possible intellect, when we are already possessed of knowledge, is an act in respect of some intelligibles, and in potentiality in respect of others. For since these separate substances are not moved, neither per se nor accidentally, as we have proved, whatever is potential in them must be actual, else they would pass from potentiality to act, and thus they would be moved per se or accidentally. There is, therefore, in them potentiality and act as regards intelligible being, just as there is in the heavenly bodies as regards natural being. For the matter of a heavenly body is so perfected by its form that it does not remain in potentiality to other forms, and in like manner the intellect of a separate substance is wholly perfected by intelligible forms with respect to its natural knowledge. On the other hand, our possible intellect is proportionate to the corruptible bodies to which it is united as a form, because it is made to have certain intelligible forms actually in such a way that it remains in potentiality to others. For this reason it is stated in De Causis that an intelligence is full of forms, since, to wit, the whole potentiality of its intellect is perfected by intelligible forms. And thus one separate substance is able to understand another through these intelligible forms. Someone, however, may think that, since a separate substance is intelligible by its nature, there is no need to assert that one is understood by another through intelligible species, but that they understand one another by the very essence of the substance understood. For it would seem that the fact of a substance being understood through an intelligible species is accidental to material substances, from their not being actually intelligible through their essence. Wherefore it is necessary for them to be understood through abstract intentions. Moreover, this seems in accord with the statement of the philosopher who says, in the second book of Metaphysics, that in separate substances there is no distinction between matter, intellect, the act of understanding, and the thing understood. And yet, if this be granted, it involves not a few difficulties. First, because the intellect in act is the thing understood in act, according to the teaching of Aristotle, and it is difficult to see how one separate substance is identified with another when it understands it. Again, every agent or operator acts through its form, to which its operation corresponds, as heating corresponds to heat. Wherefore we see the thing whose species informs the sight. Yet it does not seem possible for one separate substance to be the form of another, since each has its being separate from the other. Therefore it is seemingly impossible for the one to be seen by the other through its essence. Moreover, the thing understood is the perfection of the one who understands. Now a lower substance cannot be a perfection of a higher. It would follow, therefore, that the higher would not understand the lower, if each were understood through its essence and not by another species. Further, the intelligible object is within the intellect as to that whereby it is understood. Now no substance enters into the mind, save God alone, who is in all things by his essence, presence, and power. Therefore it is seemingly impossible for a separate substance to be understood by another through its essence, and not through its image in that other. This must indeed be true according to the opinion of Aristotle, who says that understanding takes place through the fact that the thing understood in act is one with the intellect in act. Wherefore, a separate substance, although it is by itself actually intelligible, is nevertheless not understood in itself except by an intellect with which it is one. And it is thus that a separate substance understands itself by its essence, so that, according to this, the intellect, the thing understood, and the act of understanding are the same thing. But according to the opinion of Plato, understanding takes place through contact of the intellect with the thing understood, so that, in consequence, one separate substance can understand another through its essence when it is in spiritual contact with it, the higher understanding the lower by enclosing and containing it by its power, as it were, and the lower understanding the higher as though it grasped it as its own perfection. Hence Dionysius says in On the Divine Names 4 that the higher substances are intelligible as the food of the lower substances. End of chapter 98. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 99 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation. by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 99. That separate substances know material things. By these aforesaid forms, then, a separate substance knows not only other separate substances, but also the species of corporeal things. For, since their intellect is perfect in respect of its natural perfection, being wholly in act, it follows that it comprehends its object, intelligible being, to wit, in every respect. Now, intelligible being comprises also the species of corporeal things. Therefore, a separate substance knows them. Again, since the species of things are differentiated as the species of numbers, as stated above, it follows that the higher species contains in some way that which is in the lower, even as the greater number contains the lesser. Seeing then that separate substances are above corporeal substances, it follows that whatever is contained in corporeal substances materially is contained in separate substances intelligibly, for that which is in a thing is there according to the mode of the thing in which it is. Again, if the separate substances move the heavenly bodies, as philosophers say, whatever results from the movement of the heavenly bodies is ascribed to those same bodies as instruments, since they move through being moved, and to the separate substances that move them as principal agents. Now they act and move by their intellect. Consequently, they cause whatever is done by the movement of the heavenly bodies, just as the craftsman works through his tools. Hence their forms which are generated and corrupted are in separate substances intelligibly. Wherefore Boethius, in his book De Trinitate, says that, "From forms that are without matter came the forms that are in matter." Therefore, separate substances know not only separate substances, but also the species of material things. For if they know the species of bodies subject to generation and corruption, as being the species of their proper effects, much more do they know the species of heavenly bodies as being the species of their proper instruments. Wherefore, since the intellect of a separate substance is in act, having all the images to which it is in potentiality, and since it has the power to comprehend all the species and differences of being, it follows of necessity that every separate substance knows all natural things and their whole order. Yet seeing that the intellect in act is the thing actually understood, someone might think that a separate substance does not understand material things, for it would seem incongruous that a material thing should be the perfection of a separate substance. But if the point be considered aright, the thing understood is a perfection of the one who understands, according to the image thereof in the intellect. For the stone which is outside the soul is not a perfection of our possible intellect. Now the image of the material thing is in the intellect of a separate substance immaterially, according to the mode of a separate substance, and not according to the mode of a material substance. Wherefore, there is no reason why we should not say that this image is a perfection of the separate substance's intellect as its proper form. End of chapter 99. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 100 of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 100. That separate substances know singulars. Since in the intellect of separate substances the images of things are more universal than in our intellect, and more efficacious as a medium of knowledge, it follows that separate substances, through the images of material things, know material things not only according to their generic or specific nature, but also according to their individual nature. Foreseeing that the species of things in the intellect must needs be immaterial, they cannot, as existing in our intellect, be the principle of knowing singulars, which are individualized by matter, because the species of our intellect are of such limited virtue that one leads to the knowledge only of one. Wherefore, just as the image of the generic nature cannot lead to the knowledge of genus and difference, so that the species be known thereby, in like manner the image of the specific nature cannot lead to the knowledge of the principles of individuality, which are material principles, so that the individual be known thereby in its singularity. On the other hand, the image in the intellect of a separate substance, since it is of a more universal virtue, being at the same time one and immaterial, is able to lead to the knowledge of both the specific and the individualizing principles, so that through it the separate substance is able by its intellect to know not only the generic and specific natures, but also the individual nature. Nor does it follow that the form through which it knows is material, nor that such forms are infinite according to the number of individuals. Further, whatever a lower power can do, that can a higher power do, but in a higher way. Hence the lower power works by many instruments, whereas the higher power works by one only. For a power, the higher it is, the more is it consolidated and unified, whereas, on the other hand, the lower power is disunited and multiplied. Hence we observe that the one power of the common sense apprehends the various kinds of sensibles which the five external senses perceive. Now the human soul is lower than a separate substance in the order of nature, and it is cognizant of universals and singulars through two principles, namely, sense and intellect. Consequently, a separate substance, being higher, knows both in a higher way by one principle, namely, the intellect. Again, the order in which the intelligible species of things reach our intellect is contrary to the order in which they reach the intellect of a separate substance, for they reach our intellect by a process of analysis and by abstraction from material and individualizing conditions, so that it is not possible for us to know singulars through them. On the other hand, they reach the intellect of a separate substance by a process of synthesis, as it were, since it has intelligible species through its likeness to the first intelligible species, namely, the divine intellect, which is not abstracted from things, but productive of them. Now, it is productive not merely of the form, but also of the matter which is the principle of individuality. Wherefore the species of the intellect of a separate substance represent the whole thing, not only the principles of its species, but also the principles of its individuality. Consequently, we must not deny separate substances the knowledge of singulars, although our intellect is unable to know singulars. Further, if the heavenly bodies are moved by the separate substances, according to the statement of philosophers, since separate substances act and move by their intellect, they must needs know the movable that they move. And this is some particular thing, for universals are immovable. Their positions also, which are changed by their movement, are singular things, and cannot be unknown to the substance which moves them by its intellect. We must therefore say that separate substances know singulars connected with these material things. End of chapter 100. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 101 of Summa Contra Gentiles, Second Book on Creation, by St. Thomas Aquinas. translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 101. Whether separate substances know all things at the same time by their natural knowledge. Now, since the intellect in act is the thing actually understood, as the sense in act is the thing actually sensed, according to the third book of De Anima, chapter 2, paragraph 4, and chapter 5, paragraph 2. And since the same thing cannot be several things actually at the same time, it would seem impossible for the intellect of a separate substance to have various species of things intelligible, as we have stated above. But it must be noted that not all is actually understood, the intelligible species of which is actually in the intellect. For since a substance which has understanding has also a will, and consequently has the control of its action, it is in its power, when it already has an intelligible species, to make use of it for understanding actually. Or, if it have several species, to use one of them. Wherefore, we do not actually consider all the things whereof we possess knowledge. Therefore, an intellectual substance that has knowledge through several species uses one of them as it will, and thereby knows actually at the same time all that he knows by one species. For they are all as one intelligible thing insofar as they are known through one species, even as our intellect knows at the same time several things compared or related to one another as one individual thing. But it does not know at the same time the things which it knows through different species. Therefore, as there is one understanding, so is there one thing actually understood. Accordingly, in the intellect of a separate substance, there is a certain succession of understandings. There is not, however, movement, properly speaking, since act does not succeed potentiality, but act succeeds act. Whereas the divine intellect, forasmuch as it knows all things through one, namely the divine essence, and because its act is its essence, knows all things at the same time. Consequently, there is no succession in his understanding, but his act of intelligence is wholly perfect at the same time, and endureth through all ages. Amen. End of section 101. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C., Toulouse, France. This project was recorded between December 2021 and January 2022. End of Summa Contra Gentiles, second book on creation.